Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, South Africa has come out strongly against the African Union's decision to give Israel observer status at the body, which represents, as its name suggests, all African countries that are member states of it. South Africa saying that this decision was taken unilaterally without consulting its members, and it said that it is appalled at the unjust and unwarranted decision of the EU Commission to grant Israel observer status in the African Union. South Africa certainly has always taken a strong stance when it comes to the issue of Israel-Palestine on the side of Palestinians, and one wonders what exactly the EU hopes to achieve by giving Israel this observer status. We do know that Israel has a significant outreach to African countries at this time. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Bram, who is a board member of Africa for Palestine. He is a human rights campaigner and activist. He is joining us today from Cape Town. Joining us today from Johannesburg is Jeenah, who is the executive director of the Afro-Middle East Center. And joining us from Delta State in Nigeria is Dr. Ngboawaji Daniel, who is a professor and head of the Department of Intelligence and Security Studies at Novena University. Ngboawaji, Naeem, and Bram, thank you to all three of you for taking your time out of your schedules to join us today. Ngboawaji, let me start with you firstly and give us the African viewpoint and your opinion about why the AU may have made this decision at this time.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody and co-panelists. It's my sincere pleasure to be part of this expose this afternoon, and greetings from Nigeria. I must say categorically that the decision by the AU chair to unilaterally grant Israel an observer's status with the African Union is what I can safely say is a clear case of executive rascality, if you ask me. However, let me make it very clear here that I know that obviously he must have acted, due to some pressure and prompt from some forces that are putting pressure on him. There are, some interests in Africa that tend to align with the nation of Israel. Having said that, when it comes to Israeli-Palestinian relationship vis-a-vis that of Africa, most of us will try as much as possible to be as safe as possible in analyzing it on the basis of, the emergence of extreme, ideological leanings between Palestine and Israel beyond the scope of mere religion.
Right.
That being said, I know that in recent years, the events in the AU has clearly shown some significant level of weakness in leadership as a result of what I refer to a series of binational and international tension on the continent of Africa. And that has gone a long way to rob the AU of so much force that it used to have in those days.
Bram, let me bring you in. Is this proof of successful Israeli lobbying? I know that sounds like a fairly obvious question, but is this proof of that?
No, I think that they've made some inroads. They definitely have, in our opinion, corrupted certain politicians. And this is not something we say lightly. As an organization, we are in touch with numerous of government officials in a number of the countries that are represented in the AU. And the Israeli regime and their lobbyists have very blatantly been leveraging aid, been leveraging removal of Zimbabwe from the sanctions list and things like that to try bully, bribe, and manipulate African states to take the position they've taken. And the bribery varies from blatant cash injections to security information to providing security support against the boogie monster of terrorism. So it's certainly a step back for Palestinian solidarity on the continent, but it's also a very important eye-opener that Israel is working hard on our continent and is trying to bribe its way in.
I would think that those who would defend the EU would say, listen, Palestine's an observer at the EU, so why not Israel?
Sure, and that's the kind of argument that will be made, and in some ways has already been made by countries such as Rwanda, Kenya, Ghana, and others that support the Israeli position. The reality, however, is that the AU, and before it the OAU was formed as a coalition of states that fought against colonialism. Later as a coalition that fought against apartheid. The AU took over that legacy of being anti-colonial, of being anti-apartheid, and we see that in the AU's Constitutive Act. So the idea that it would accept as an observer a state that is a colonialist state, that is an apartheid state, and is guilty for the kinds of gross human rights violations that Israel is for most people on the continent very grating to our consciences. But yes, that is the kind of argument that will be made when the Executive Council meets in 2 months' time to debate this issue.
So, Ngboawaji, I wonder, having Israel, having observer status then at the AU, does this in some ways, do you think, mean as well that Africa, and maybe I'm overstating this, that it will have some influence over the issue of Israel-Palestine? I mean, do you think that this is a relationship which can work then both ways, where then Africa can almost have some influence over Israel as well?
Well, let me make this point very clear. We are living in Africa, during a period that we are extremely vulnerable in terms of economic and developmental challenges, and coupled with serious security challenges on the continent, and of course the current global pandemic, which has further ravaged the African economy. So I see a situation where it appears that some powers out there have noticed the vulnerability of Africa, and they are trying as much as possible to balance out what, one of the speakers had previously said, and of course what you said, that, okay, if Palestine is there, Israel should also be there. But I want to say that the timing is predicated on the fact that, this continent is almost on her knees and needs, some powers to come in. Having said that, however, I will, legitimately say that even if some of these decisions must be taken to ensure that both, the Israeli and, Palestinian crisis are moderated vis-a-vis their interests on the continent of Africa, these things must go through the normal procedure where appropriate debates are taken, the pros and cons are looked into, and of course, the African voice generally is heard before some of these decisions are taken. But I can assure you that the main reason why we're having all of this is that there is a perception out there that Africa is vulnerable, Africa is weak, and so some manipulations can take place, and for whatever reasons they intend to achieve.
Bram, do you agree with that? Is Africa at this point in time perceived as weak in your opinion? And is that, do you think, why Israel was able to make this opening, was able to get this status?
Look, it's extremely opportunistic, and we hold a view, or at least I personally hold a view that it's going to be a stillborn initiative. South Africa is one of the major role players on the continent. Our own interactions with several of the countries that we believe have sold out on the issue indicate that they won't be as firm when it comes to the AU meeting. I think the fact that it was announced in the way it was announced was a PR stunt and claiming false victory. I think, fortunately, the AU and the continent, particularly with South Africa taking a strong position on the matter, will not allow it to happen. But it's extremely concerning that the announcement and that engagement was allowed and tolerated, and hopefully there will even be consequences for those who took their own prerogative to undermine the standing position of the AU.
You know, I'm just going to play devil's advocate with you one more time. I do apologize, I'm putting you on the spot regarding these sorts of questions, but I wonder, you know, the argument can be made, listen, the AU is sort of like, you know, the United Nations, but simply for the African continent and its interests, as well as the member states' interests. Having Israel as an observer doesn't necessarily mean that the AU agrees with Israeli policies. This may even mean that it can call out Israel more directly to its face, so to speak. Is that a bad thing?
Well, it's not a valid thing. The reality is that the African Union is a union of African states. And that means that African states, which are good, bad, problematic, democratic, monarchical, whatever, but of African states. In terms of other role players, whether international NGOs or non-African states, the admission of them as observers is based on whether that would be to the benefit of the African continent, whether it would be to the benefit of member states. And in this case, certainly it will not. Israel doesn't care about Africa in terms of playing any kind of role on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. So no, Africa and the AU will have no influence on that. On the other hand, as an observer, Israel will have an impact on the African Union. Observer states are able to attend a whole range of meetings. Observer states are able to speak at various kinds of debates. One can imagine that 2 months ago, when the African Union issued a very strong statement against Israel's violations in Gaza, in ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem, etc., one can imagine that if that debate took place while Israel was an observer state, either that statement would not have been issued or it would have been an entirely watered down version of the statement. So on the one hand, you have Israel being able to influence decisions at the AU, but the AU will have no role to play in the Israeli issue itself. And if I can just respond to your earlier issue as well,
sure.
I'm not as convinced as Bram about how the situation is going to turn out. What we have is a situation where the chairperson of the AU Commission acted kind of in terms of his powers, because as Commission chairperson, he has the power to grant observer status, but he has to take into consideration the Constitutive Act of the AU and the known views and concerns of member states. He did neither of the two. So he will argue that he has the right to do it, and he has done it. We've had objections now from 5 member states: Tunisia, Algeria, South Africa, Namibia, and Lesotho. This means that it will now be tabled at an Executive Council meeting where it will be debated. It is not clear that the majority of African states will support the position that Israel should not be a member, should not be an observer state or observer member, because Israel has done an enormous amount of work, and it's not just because Africa is weak at this time, you know, that's debatable in itself, but Israel has done an enormous amount of work over decades to come to the position where they can confidently say that a number of African states will support them. Just last year, 30 heads of African states met in Tel Aviv.
So, Ngboawaji, I wanted to get your response to what Naeem there just said, because certainly, I mean, obviously Africa is not a weak continent. It is extremely influential if it's able to unite, and secondly, able to understand its strength in many, many regards. But beyond that factor, I wanted to ask you if you think that in this way, as Naeem there also laid out for us, that this actually does show very successful Israeli planning, long-term planning, really, that it's been able to bring enough of the African states that it needs to be able to then have, you know, some form of influence of significance on the continent.
Well, when I said that you know, people see Africa as a weak region, I'm not talking about the race situation in Africa as it were. I'm talking about the perception, you know, by some of these, you know, strong global powers, you know, like the last speaker said, before some of these things are pushed ahead, there are quite a lot of lobbying and a lot of undercurrent, you know, that takes years, if not decades, you know, to manifest. Like I said before, there is a general perception, and of course I stand by that, oh, this continent is always in need of one support or the other, and so we can come in and, offer, some kind of, possible assistance to the continent, and that, can water down, their resistance in several ways. And of course, whether we like it or not, a lot of powers at one time or the other had, approached Africa, with offers of different forms of help, grants, aids, and what have you. But in this case, like I said, I know that Israel is conscious of 1.2 billion people living on the continent of Africa. Israel is also conscious of the growing radical ideological, sentiments, in Africa. And of course, I know that part of her reason, as much as possible, is to try to, embark on some diplomatic countermeasures, that will try as much as possible to tame some of these sentiments, knowing fully well that there are quite a lot of, international exchanges and connections between radical ideological, groups all over the world. So naturally, Israel will want as much as possible to equate whatever relationship Palestine and her allies have with Africa. And so for me, it is, Israel's, right to do what she's doing right now. But the point I'm trying to say, just like the speaker has said, the last speaker said, that Israel has everything, to influence, while Africa may not have much to do. Yeah. I am saying that the main reason why this is coming up at this point, and why they believe that it's going to succeed at this point, is that they know that if they come to Africa with this offer at this point in time, it's going to fly. Because if you ask me, and there is no gainsaying about that, we are sincerely in need of all forms of assistance, real and imagined, from people, from nations all over the world. Yes.
All right, so Bram and Naeem, we're quickly running out of time, so I just want to give you each the final word. We have about a minute for each of you. So Bram, I want to ask you very quickly, the issue of Israel-Palestine, why is this an important one for Africa specifically, not just for South Africa? For South Africa, it's quite obvious, the history of South Africa really makes that quite a clear stance that it takes. But then why should this still be important for the rest of Africa?
Well, I think it speaks to a moral and ideological standpoint. There have been inroads by more right-wing political parties with different outlooks and attempts by Israel to get in. I think that Africa has a responsibility, and I believe it will live up to that responsibility. I think just on the issue of how this thing transpired, if Israel were so confident that they had enough member states and the power to make it happen, there would have been no need for them to jump the gun. There would be no need for them to announce prior to those processes, the meeting of 2 months from now and so on. Rather, they could have placed it on the agenda and lobbied and succeeded. So I still hold some hope, even though I know others don't. And hopefully, I think we'll all agree that we do hope that it will be blocked and that it won't succeed and that it will be a failure, what they're trying to achieve. Because we do know as Africa that we have an immense, huge responsibility to show our solidarity to the people of Palestine.
I'll give you a final word. What does this then show for the future, the near future, long-term, midterm future, about where Africa stands vis-a-vis Palestine? Are the people's minds also changing?
I don't think that the people's minds are changing. I mean, we saw yesterday, the day before yesterday, a statement issued by civil society organizations, possibly for a very long time the most wide and broad and united statement by civil society organizations across the continent opposing the granting of observer status to Israel. So I don't think that the people are united in that way, but certainly many governments get benefits from Israel, have been getting benefits from Israel for many years, and some of them have made it clear already that they will support Israel in this issue. The other thing, of course, is that Israel hopes that this will mean that it would be able to leverage African state support at the United Nations. So, Israel has a lot to gain. I think that we have a lot to lose. Many of those states, of course, that support Israel also buy Israeli surveillance technology, the Pegasus and all of that, and use it against their own governments. I mean, Rwanda used it against the South African president. So clearly, they believe that they can benefit from Israel.
Very well. Well, but we really appreciate Naeem, Ngboawaji, as well as Bram, for taking their time out of their schedules to speak to us today. We were discussing there the fact that South Africa, as well as a number of other key member states of the African Union, have protested the decision by the AU to give Israel observer status at its, of course, body. What does this mean for Israel's influence or in Africa at this point in time, and even at the body? As Naeem there mentioned to us, it's not an equal-sided relationship. So Israel will have significant powers if, hypothetically, this observer status decision does go through, and that's still not a sure thing either way. So we'll wait and see certainly how this goes, and we will try to keep a very close eye on what this then means for Israel-Palestine and any changes in stances on the African continent towards that issue. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss a topic we have not discussed in a while now, and that is overall the issue of Srebrenica genocide and how it's perceived specifically in Bosnia, as well as many people around the world as well. We right now have had a UN official not too long ago, the High Representative Valentin Inzko, who has said that genocide denial is banned, is forbidden, and has put out very specific statements in that regard. Bosnian Serbs have reacted very angrily because, as we know, there's always been questioning on certain people's parts about exactly what happened in Srebrenica, as well as that entire issue of the war in Yugoslavia, and whether or not it was a genocide. In many people's minds, that is still a question mark, even though for the rest of us around the world, it probably isn't. But in many people's minds, it still very much is, and it still continues to then create controversies, even after the UN trials, even after all the accountability, and I'm in quotation marks, I'm putting that accountability word, that has taken place. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Amra Sabic-El-Rayess, who is the author of the acclaimed book, The Cat I Never Named, A True Story of Love, War, and Survival. She is a professor at Columbia University and is also a genocide survivor, in fact, from Bosnia itself. She's joining us this morning from New York. Joining us from Munich in Germany is Dr. Marie-Janine Calic, who is a professor of East and Southeast European history, at the University of Munich. She is the author of two books, A History of Yugoslavia, as well as The Great Cauldron, A History of Southeastern Europe. Marie-Janine and Amra, thank you both for taking your time out to speak to us today here in Scope. Marie-Janine, I'd like to start with you. What are your thoughts about the UN official coming out so strongly, saying that genocide denial in this case is to be banned and that there should be punishment for that? Was that the right way to go about this?
Well, I think the new law is rather symbolic because it's true that the Serbs, the genocide in Srebrenica for many years, and the situation has also worsened. But the question remains how the law can be implemented in the future. It remains to be seen whether and how this law can be implemented, because the key role will be played by the State Prosecutor's Office and the Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they have not worked very efficiently in the past years. And the real question is, can historical truth be established by law? Historical truth concerns facts and not opinions, and you will not change the minds of people. So in that, I believe the law has a very symbolic meaning, and we will see in the future what it will bring.
That's a very good point, isn't it, Amra, that a law in and of itself will not change people's minds. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with that. I think the key element of what happens next is going to be the implementation of the law. But I also do hope that the international community is, with this law, going to stop to deliver these symbolic decisions relating to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Just thinking back to the moment when Srebrenica genocide was implemented by the Serb forces in Bosnia, at the time, that did not have And those resolutions regarding the UN safe areas only made the West feel good about stating that they would, in fact, take action when in reality there was no real intent to implement the safe area UN resolutions. So I do hope that the international community will not repeat that error again, because the denial of genocide in Bosnia by many Serb leaders in particular has been ongoing for years. And in the event that it does not end, in the event that there is no acknowledgement and recognition of the past war crimes and atrocities that targeted Bosnian Muslims, I do worry that we might see in the future another conflict in the Balkans. And I do believe that the EU, the United States, or the rest of the world do not want to see the repetition of the past in the Balkans.
Yeah, Marie-Janine, Amra there made a really good point that for the region to be able to move forward in a peaceful fashion, we need to really acknowledge what's happened, right? Why do you think, and what do you think is holding those who are not acknowledging what happened historically, factually on the ground? What's holding them back from accepting that?
Well, the memory is decided, and memory politics in Bosnia is divided. People see the own nation only as victims of the other, and they see the other side only as collective perpetrators. The Serb nationalist discourse alleges that the West aims at punishing the Serb nation collectively and that it intends to humiliate the Serbs. It also claims that the High Representative was biased against them. So they have announced a boycott of all major institutions in Bosnia and Herzegovina, like the joint presidency, the parliament, and the government, and they have even announced unilateral decisions. I think the real problem behind these debates and also the law is that it seems to refer to the present, but in fact it relates to many political conflicts. The term genocide and Srebrenica is a metaphor for current political and identity-related conflicts. It relates to the question what the debate really means. Who is responsible for the war? Who is responsible for atrocities? How do we see the identity of our community? But also in what kind of state and polity do we want to live? So the whole issue of acknowledging or not Srebrenica and genocide relates to the question of identity and political legitimacy.
So then, Amra, how does one approach this issue for the Serbs themselves? I know I'm asking a very direct question. Is this an issue of educating them and not trying to stain every single Serb, you know what I mean? Like not an overbroad, just black stain on every single Serb out there. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that that's what you or anybody else would call for, but I would think in their minds, possibly that is why they're hesitant to sign on to this.
Well, you brought up a really important question, which is, in addition to these legal decisions that have been in place, and we know that international courts have undeniably established that the genocide was committed by the Serb forces and endorsed by the Serb political leaders during the war between 1992 and 95. But I do think it's very important to make that distinction and not really collectively blame an entire group of people. And I say that because over the last year, since I had published my book, The Cat I Never Named, which really tells my own story, but in many ways tells the stories of many Bosnian Muslims, that captures the suffering and the horrific experiences that we had simply because we are Bosnian Muslims. I have received hundreds of letters and notes from Bosnian Serbs specifically, as well as Serbs from Serbia, who have apologized to me, who have said that they do not stand behind this politics that is centered on glorification of war criminals. Really, the only reason why Milorad Dodik and other Serb leaders continue to glorify war crimes and deny genocide is because they're using divide and conquer kind of political formula to remain in power. If we think back years ago, in fact, Dodik emerged as a leader in Bosnia who acknowledged some of these war atrocities, and he was seen by the West initially as potentially a positive leader. But the environment in Bosnia, disengagement from the international community, has allowed the ethnic hatred to be revived and for the politicians to benefit from that division. So I do think that we need a multi-pronged approach. I think we do need to ensure that this law is not symbolic, that it is actually implemented. And I understand that the Bosnia's prosecutor has already is considering several cases that his office intends to prosecute. But I also, as an educator who's a professor at Columbia's Teachers College, believe that education is key. Books like The Cat I Never Named need to be read in schools in the Serb part of Bosnia, and that is unfortunately not the case today.
Marie-Janine, how does one bring these two groups of people, and I'm not talking about necessarily the leaders, closer together? I mean, as Amra there said, in response to her book, and I imagine possibly in response to your books as well, there have been more understanding on the part of even the opposing side, if I may use that broad term. Is this just a question of, and I would think it is, of just hate politics, right? Politicians staying in office just because hate, unfortunately, does sell.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key problem is that in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the war, there was no total defeat by either side or total victory by either side. And the peace was imposed from above. The conflict was frozen. So that the conflict in a way continues, but not militarily, but it has been transferred to the political field and to the symbolic historical interpretations field. History has shown that normalization and even reconciliation is possible in the moment that the political decision is made to go ahead with normalization and reconciliation. And indeed, at the moment, there are political elites in place and even politicians who were in office in the 1990s and who were responsible for the war and the atrocities committed. And these politicians have no interest whatsoever in normalization or in acknowledgement of facts. I believe that constructive dealing with the past requires many measures. It requires justice, which is the work of the courts and of the International Criminal Tribunal, but it also requires a sense of security for normal people, personal security and collective security, and it requires prospects of well-being. People have to see a better future, which they currently do not. And
there's also talk a lot about this UN High Representative making this decision about genocide denial right towards the end of his his tenure. I know there's been a little bit of criticism of that this is a little too late. Pardon me. Is that true? Do you think that this will stick? Because as both of you have in fact spoken about, there are challenges to this sort of genocide denial ban, right? I mean, it's not just going to happen overnight. It's not like everyone's just going to sign on. The Bosnian Serbs have already said they will not. I wonder if the United Nations too has played a bit of a weak role.
I think the international community really has slept through the last decade in Bosnia and has allowed the hatred and ethnic tensions and politicians who have benefited from that division to really go unchecked. And I do agree with you that this decision has come a bit late, but at the same time, I do believe that this is an important first step. And I would hope, in fact, that the international community would express its support, not only for genocide denial, this particular ban against genocide denial to be implemented in Bosnia, but also symbolically for other countries to join in, like Pakistan or the United States or Germany or the UK, to come out and similarly adopt resolutions and decisions within their governments that ban a genocide denial in Bosnia. Because unless we take a really strong stance that the execution of people on a mass scale in an organized fashion simply because of their ethnic, racial, religious background is unacceptable, we will not move ahead globally as humanity towards a better future. I do believe that we have global issue of rising hate, rising far-right movement, and really a global hate movement that we've witnessed in the United States, we have witnessed in Western Europe. So this kind of hate and tendency towards genocidal killings is not really exclusive to groups or people or individuals in the Balkans area. And I think making a stronger statement going forward, hopefully with the support of the US government and the Biden administration, will be critical for the Balkans, but also for the change and social transformation that we need globally in terms of the hate narratives that have been on the rise.
Marie-Janine, give you the final word. Sitting from your vantage point there in Germany, I would think that, and I wanted to ask, in fact, what do you think the German government can do, considering its own, the history that exists there regarding genocide and such acts there, and the greater international community, what more can be done?
Actually, Germany has a law banning genocide denial. It's focused on the Holocaust. And other European countries also have introduced laws against denial, some of them against genocides in general. So Europe is giving the example. And I really do hope that the next High Representative, Mr. Insco's successor, who is a German, will be very strong on the issue in his next term.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that, but we really, really appreciate Marie-Janine and Amra for this really, really insightful conversation. We appreciate the information they've given to us, the context they've provided for us on this very vital issue. It's not spoken of enough, as both of our guests are mentioned, and it's really sad because this has the potential to go very, very wrong if the international community does not ensure that these communities are brought together, that there's genuine accountability and understanding of really the facts of what happened during the Srebrenica genocide. Until those facts are not accepted, how can we then move forward? And again, it's not about just labeling an entire community of Serbs as bad or as responsible for the genocide in any way. It's those specific people that did it. But yes, we need to accept that those specific people did it, and we need to then bring these communities together so that in the Balkans, as well as the rest of the region, we can have peace. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.